So time to work on the favorites feature. Let's start with the favorites screen. On the favorites screen, thus far I only say the favorites. It's not bad, but maybe we want to show some more meaningful text if we have no favorites. Like, you have no favorites yet, start adding some. But of course we also want to allow the user to add some and then also output the favorites here. For that, the first question is, how do we save, or where do we save which items, which meals the user marked as favorites? We could add a new field in our dummy data, and therefore in the meal model here, where we have something like a bool is favorite, which can be edited. We could do that, but it's a bit unrealistic. In reality, we would probably fetch some data from a server, and if we store the "this is our favorite" data directly on the meal, then this would not be scoped to our user. Instead, every user that fetches the data from the server would now have this as a favorite. So storing this on the meal itself might not be perfect. We could do it here, of course, for this dummy app, but I'd rather use a different approach. In the main Dart file here, where we manage our filters, I also want to manage a list of favorites. That's the approach I prefer. So there we have our list of meals, which are the available meals. I want to have a second list of meals, which are our favorited meals. Now, by default, that's an empty list, because at the beginning we have no favorite meals. Favorite meals. So by default, we have no favorite meals, but now I can forward these favorite meals here to our favorites screen. The problem with that, of course, is that the favorites screen is not part of our route registration here. Well, but it's part of our tabs screen, right? In the tabs screen, we get access to the favorites screen. So we can simply forward favorite meals to the tabs screen, and in the tabs screen here, we now can accept this as an input. So here we get our list of meals, and the name here is favorite meals, and the meal is the model which we have to import by going to the models folder and then pointing at the meal Dart file. And of course we add the constructor here to save our favorite meals. So now we have the favorite meals in the tabs screen, and there we can forward them to the favorites screen, which we are creating here. So we can go to favorites screen and now forward widget.favoritemeals. So now in the favorites screen, we can also accept that. And again, in the state management module, we'll learn a different way of managing and passing our data around so that we don't have to go through multiple layers of widgets and pass our data through constructors. But for the moment, it is what it is. So here we also have a list of meals in the favorites screen. Therefore, we import our meal model from the models folder. And I will name this favorite meals here as well. Of course, you could pick a different name. And favorites screen receives these favorite meals as an input, so as an argument here in the constructor. Now we can work with the favorite meals here. However, we'll have a problem in the tab screen. Widget is not available here when we initialize our properties. You can use the widget property in the build method, you can use it in init state, but you can't use it here when you initialize these properties. It's a problem that's easy to solve, however. Since we're in a stateful widget, and therefore in the state object here, we can simply add init state here, the init state method, and do our initialization of pages in there. So cut that code here and create this in a non-final way. And then here in init state, set pages equal to that list. Because here in init state widget is available, it will still run before build executes. So we'll have no problem there with that screen not being loadable or anything like that. So we will have everything set up when build runs, but we avoid that issue of widget, of that property, not being available at the point of time we're initializing this class. And in general, by the way, when you're initializing a class, in this property, you can't refer to any other property. So for example, I couldn't set this equal to pages here either. You can't refer to other properties because the creation of the class isn't fully finished. That's also why we can't refer to the widget property. So with that, however, by using init state, this should all work. And now we can forward our favorite meals from the main file to the tabs screen and from the tabs screen to the favorites screen. Now in the main.dart file, we only need to add some logic to add or remove meals to and from the favorites. That logic for adding and removing favorites should be managed in the new method here in the main.dart file in our myAppState class. The method will not return anything, and I'll name it toggle favorite. Now here I expect to get the ID of the meal, which is a string, that should be turned into a favorite or unfavorited. And with that information received, the goal now is to add it to this favorite meals list. However, of course, only add it if it's not already part of that list, because if it already is part of that list, then I want to remove that meal, because it's a toggle method that should either add or remove. We can do this with favorite meals and then index where. This checks whether a certain element is part of that list and then automatically gives us the index of that meal if it is part. If it's not part, the index will simply be -1. So I'll store this in a final variable, existing index. And here, as so often, you pass a function which receives the meal, so which runs on every element on the list you're running index where on, and this should return true or false. So I will compare the meal ID with the meal ID I'm getting. And if I find a meal in favorite meals where this condition is met, then I know that then I will get the index of that meal in the favorite meals list. And I need that index to then remove it there, because if a meal with that ID is already part of favorite meals, then I want to remove it because it's a toggle method. If I don't find a meal, then existing index will be -1, and I know that I have to add that meal. So now here, I'll check if existing index is greater or equal than 0. Because if it's -1, then I didn't find anything. If it's greater or equal than 0, then I know that I did find a meal. And therefore, if it is greater, then I want to remove a meal. So I will call setState here. And in that function we pass to setState, I'll call favorite meals and use remove@, which takes the index of the element I want to remove. And that's my existing index. So this will now remove the element at that index from the favorite meals list. And since it's in its state, it will rebuild, therefore rebuild the material app with the routes table and pass an updated favorite meals list to tabs screen, because that's all rebuilt. Now else, if I didn't find the element, then I will also use setState, and I will then use favorite meals add to add an element. And there I want to reach out to my dummy meals or to the available meals, but I will use dummy meals so that filtering doesn't play a role, because you should also be able to toggle recipes which are not matching your filters. So here I'll use dummy meals and then first where to find the first element, the first meal in our data source, in our meal source, which has the same ID, with that good old function we passed there where we get the meal, and where I then simply return meal ID equals meal ID. So that gives me the meal with the same ID in our data source. The first meal I find with that ID is then added to favorite meals. Now again, that of course means that whenever I toggle a meal as a favorite or turn it into a non-favorite, then this build method is called, and therefore the entire app is rebuilt. Now this is of course not optimal, as you can imagine, because switching the favorite status of a meal should not necessarily impact the entire app. And therefore, this is the number one topic we'll toggle after this course section once we dive into state management, because for bigger apps, you definitely need a more elegant way. For the moment, this is fine, but it is definitely something we'll improve later in the next course section. So for the moment, it's fine that we rebuild everything though, and we just need to make sure that toggle favorite actually reaches the detail page of a meal, because there I want to be able to toggle the favorite status. In the meal detail screen widget, instead of having that floating action button, which deletes this meal, which was just a demo for showing you how you can pop data and so on, instead of having this, I want to use this floating action button to let the user favorite or unfavorite a meal. So on this floating action button here, when this gets pressed, I want to call this toggle favorite function here in main Dart, this method. Hence, we should pass a reference to this method down to the meal detail screen here in the constructor in our routes table. And now in the meal detail screen there, I just need to accept this. So I'll add a new property here, a function, toggle favorite seems to be a fitting name. Of course, you can pick any name you want. And now add the constructor and bind the data, the argument we're getting, to that property. And then we can use toggle favorite down there on the floating action button when this is pressed, and simply use the reference to the function here without parentheses so that the function gets executed when the user presses the button. Now, of course, we can also find a better icon, and the icon should also reflect whether this currently is a favorite or not. And for that, I'll add another method in main, because main has the information about which items are favorites and which not. There, I'll add another function, another method in the main Dart file, in the myAppState class here. Another method which will return a boolean, which I'll name isMealFavorite, because it will check if a meal is a favorite or not. It receives the ID of a meal, and then here I want to return true if that ID is part of my favorite meals list. So we can check if favorite meals, and now there's a any method which you can use on lists. So you're learning a lot about list methods here in this course too. So there is a any method which you can use on any Dart list that also, as so often, takes a function which it runs on every list element. And here I want to return meal.id equals ID. And what I'm doing here is I'm checking if the meal I'm looking at, because this function runs for every meal, has the ID I'm checking if that meal with that ID here is a favorite. So I'm running this function on every meal I have in favorite meals, and any returns true if I find any element in here where this is true, and it will stop after the first element it found. So it will essentially give me true if I have a meal in favorite meals which has the ID I get here in isMealFavorite. And now I will pass this method here, a reference, a pointer at this method, to the meal detail screen as well, as a second argument. And in the meal detail screen, we therefore now can also store this in a property. Final function, which I'll also name is favorite maybe. I get this here as a second argument, is favorite. And now we can call is favorite to find out whether this meal we're currently looking at is a favorite or not. We can do that here in the floating action button to show a different icon based on whether it is a favorite or not. We can call isFavorite, and we just have to forward the ID of the meal we're looking at. Now that ID is something we have because we're extracting it here into meal ID based on the data we're getting when this route is loaded. We're getting this with the modal route of context approach. So meal ID is a variable we create here in build, which has the ID of the meal we're looking at. So I pass meal ID to isFavorite, and this will return true if the meal is a favorite and return false otherwise. Now if it returns true, and I'll use a ternary expression here, then the icon I want to render here should use the star icon, which is that filled star. Otherwise, I want to use the star border icon, which is the empty star. so that when this is a favorite, we see the filled star. If it's not a favorite yet, we see the empty star. And when we tap this, this will of course change, because then we'll add this meal to our favorites thanks to toggle favorite, which is linked to that method here in the main Dart file, to that toggle favorite method there. So that was a long story. With that, we're not yet outputting our favorites on the favorites screen though. So on the favorite screen, to output that, we first of all need to check if we have favorites. So here I'll check if favorite meals, so if this property, which is a list of favorites we're getting, if it is empty, we can do this with the isEmpty property, which Flutter or which Dart gives us automatically on every list. And if it is empty, then I want to return this centered text here in the end. Else, I'll return something else in my build method. I'll return a list of meals. So then I want to return basically the same list I have here in the category meals screen. There we have that list view builder function call. I'll just copy that because that's exactly what I want to return here in the favorites screen. Of course, meal item is a widget I need to import in order to use it here. So I'll import from the widgets folder meal item Dart. And now we have to pass in that data. And of course, instead of displayed meals, that is favorite meals. So here I'll use favorite meals in all these places down there, favorite meals index in all these places. And when we remove an item, well, that's not required anymore simply. We can get rid of that. I only had this in there temporarily to show you how to pass data back. We don't need it anymore. We can also get rid of that remove item thing here in the category meal screen. And of course, now also go to the meal item and not expect this anymore. So there on the constructor, we shouldn't expect this remove item thing here anymore. So let's remove that argument here and remove that final property. And of course, comment this out. We don't need that anymore. With that, connection here crashed. Let me restart the app here. And we should now have a setup where we hopefully are able to mark our meals as favorites and see them in the favorites tab. And then also, of course, switch them back to not being a favorite if we want to. So let's wait for this to finish and let's then see it in action. So here I am. If I go to favorites, I see you have no favorites yet, which makes sense. If I now go here to quick and easy, then I get an error if I try to see the detail page. And the problem I have is actually, if you have a look at the error message, that type string void is not a subtype of type empty to void. So this means somewhere we have a function where either we passed a string as an argument and it expected no argument, or it expected a string as an argument and we passed nothing. It has to be one of the two things. And we do. Toggle favorite. Here in meal detail, I am pointing at toggle favorite, and this is coming from the main Dart file. And their toggle favorite indeed expects to get my ID, which is a string. So just pointing at it as I'm doing it here will not work. Instead, we have to pass in a concrete value here. So we will wrap this in an anonymous function. And then here I want to forward my meal ID, of course, because we need that in order to set the ID, to toggle this as a favorite. So with that, let's restart it. And now if I go to quick and easy, Toast Hawaii, now I can load this page. And now let me click that empty star. It's empty because it's not a favorite yet. And now it's filled out. And let me do the same for maybe, let's say here, for the delicious orange mousse. Also a favorite now. And let's go back and now to the favorites tab. And there we see these two items. And now I can, of course, also go there and, well, make this a non-favorite, the delicious orange mousse. And if I go back, still part of that screen though. Now if I go to categories and back to favorites, now it's gone. So why are items still a part of the favorites screen if I mark them as non-favorites when I then go back?